I'm gonna start and tell you a bit about our project. I should say two things to start out with. This is our the third co-PI, Moin Syed, in the picture there. Hopefully someday you'll get to meet him. He's very nice. The other thing is that we're in the first wave of data collection this semester, so we don't really have data to, we have a lot of data sitting there, but we don't have data to present to you today. So we'll mostly be focusing on the kind of theoretical framework and the questions. And the main question that Colin and I both started out with that we were interested in and what drew us to this project was the question about the relationship between well-being and virtue. How do they develop together? How does virtue help or maybe even hinder well-being? And one sort of intuitive way of thinking about the relationship between well-being and virtue, I think maybe especially if you're a psychologist, so if you want to empirically investigate the relationship, and a sort of, first guess kind of way of doing that might be to ask whether virtue causes subjective well-being, defined in terms of life satisfaction and positive and negative affect balance. And maybe even more specifically to ask the question, does pro-social behavior cause subjective well-being? I have no complaints about that intuitive way of doing things, and I think there's been some interesting research that approaches the question that way, but I think it's not the right way to go for attempts at cross-disciplinary research, and that's because the conception of well-being that it supposes is quite narrow and furthermore rejected by just about every philosopher on the planet. So if you want to do work that's going to get uptake from philosophers, which of course I do, being a philosopher, you need to think about well-being in some other way. So my view, and I think I've convinced Colin and Moin of this so far, is that we should try to be ecumenical about well-being. So that whatever the findings that we have about the relationship between well-being and virtue can be useful to philosophers who are thinking about well-being in a variety of different ways. Now, partly my view about the desirability of being ecumenical has to do with the fact that when I look at the lay of the land in the well-being research in philosophy, I think it's pessimistic I think it's would be overly optimistic to think there's going to be a winner anytime soon of the going theories. So there's an interesting conversation about what that means for progress in philosophy, but putting that aside, I think it makes a lot more sense to do something that's appealing to people who have different theoretical frameworks. And the way that we're going to be ecumenical is by attending to personal projects. Personal projects, Brian Little, who created the methodology that we're using in the study, personal projects analysis. Little defines them as extended sets of personally salient actions in a context. You can think of personal projects as goals, life goals. When I talk about them in my own theorizing about well-being, I use the word values. It's a very, very broad category, as you'll see, and I'm going to give you some examples of the participants' personal projects soon. You can also look at success in terms of values that are necessary for pursuing your personal projects. So something like mental health, even if someone doesn't list that as a value, you do need to be mentally healthy in order to succeed in terms of many personal projects that people do list explicitly as their projects. So that's relevant information. And then last, I do think subjective well-being measures, like standard life satisfaction and positive and negative affect measures, are important, partly because people do actually value those things. And as you'll see, some people have happiness, psychological feeling happy, as one of their personal projects. And there are a lot of philosophical theories where even though subjective well-being is not identified as well-being itself, it's still important in various ways, as I hope you'll see. So the first thing I'm going to do now is tell you just a little bit about personal projects analysis. This is the first phase where the participants, who are all students for us, so I'll just call them students, they're asked to list the projects that they have, and you can see that these projects kind of vary quite a bit in terms of their generality. Write the first part of my dissertation, adopt a child. Those are quite different. I'm going to give you some real examples. We've converted the personal projects analysis tool into Qualtrics, but it wasn't very pretty to show you. You can't see as much from what the Qualtrics sheet or web page looks like. So I'm just going to show you the pictures from Brian Little, one of Brian Little's papers. The second matrix is a project appraisal matrix, where the students are asked to evaluate their projects on a whole bunch of different items like value congruency, self-identity, importance, and this is just a subset of the items that we have in the appraisal matrix. And then there's this third cross-impact analysis, where the students have to rate how much their various projects either hinder or help each other. So you get a sense of which projects are connected and compatible, and which projects are mutually difficult to pursue together. There's a fourth matrix that Colin's going to talk about in a minute. But now I want to turn to the question of how using personal projects makes us ecumenical about well-being in a way that's actually helpful to philosophers. So these are probably the major, these are the main philosophical theories of well-being. I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. And what I'm going to argue is that no matter which of these theories you have, there's something to love about what we're doing. So here are, I looked at even though this, we haven't had all the students come through the lab yet to do the surveys, but from looking at, I looked at about 100, I think it was, and tried to come up with, eventually we'll sort of, the three of us will sit down and code this, figure out how to code all this information, but this grouping is just my own sense of how things how the different projects lump together. So lots and lots of students had academic projects, as you can imagine. Many had projects that had to do with career and money. Health was very significant. And then relationships, that was also a big grouping for students. So different things like, figure out my relationship with Jack. Sometimes they were quite specific. Figure out feelings about Maddie, call home, get married, raise successful children. So some of these things are much longer term than others. Some of them, you'll notice that there were personal projects, quite a few actually, that had explicitly to do with virtue, and some that had to do with religion, and also some that had to do with happiness or mental health. Now, my sort of fear when we started this, when I started this project with Colin and Moyne, was that, this is a scary thing being a philosopher and suddenly doing empirical research, is that there are facts. They're actual, people might not live up to what I think they're going to do. And I thought we might get just weird projects, like these.
These are real, right?
These are real, yeah. These are from the students. Get a new nose ring. If it had just been stuff like that, there wouldn't be much we can do with it. But fortunately, these were kind of few and far between. I thought you might enjoy seeing what your students are thinking about. Improve handwriting skills. That sort of made me happy. But okay, so let's just run through these different theories of welfare. Preference satisfaction theories and value fulfillment theory, which is my own, the theory that I defend. Preference satisfaction theories are extremely popular in philosophy, and they don't really have an analog in the psychology literature. But basically the view is that well-being consists in the satisfaction of preferences or the fulfillment of your values. So this is the easiest case for us. Obviously, Personal projects, at least as far as preference satisfactionists go in the philosophy literature, personal projects are preferences, and they count as values for me and the other value fulfillment folks that I know about. So if you're succeeding in pursuing your personal projects, then that just is what it is to achieve well-being according to these theories. So that's a very easy case, and it's probably no coincidence that I defend a theory like this and like the personal projects analysis, and but other theories, I think, have reason to care about the information here as well. Hedonism about well-being, if success in personal projects produces pleasure or positive affect, hedonists should be interested. Some students actually have something like happiness as one of their personal projects. So a hedonist isn't going to be interested in all of the personal projects that the students come up with in our study, but they will be interested. It will be interesting to them. Some subset of those projects will be interesting. Objective list theories and eudaemonist theories take well-being to consist in, for the objective list theorist, the achievement of objective goods. Eudaimonists take well-being to consist in fulfilling your nature as a human being, which typically includes cultivating the virtues. So again, and here you can see these three, Finnis, Fletcher, and Murphy, are all philosophers who defend objective list theories. Again, these theorists are going to have reason to be interested in a certain subset of the personal projects that we're talking about. Hybrid theories, which I added even though they're not usually distinguished, but because I think they're actually quite compelling. Basically, they put together objective list theories with some kind of subjective theory like hedonism, and they say what's good for a person is achieving these objective goods and enjoying them. So those folks, and I think that's a kind of developing area in the well-being literature, they'll be interested in the subset of projects that are both objectively good and enjoyed by the person pursuing them, which we'll have the data to pick out which projects those are. What about virtue? I'm going to go really quickly here and basically just say the Aristotelian conception of virtue, however much you like it, it's not empirically tractable, so forget it. And well, I'm taking up too much time. That's the only reason that I'm doing this. I have way more to say, Nancy. I don't mean forget it. I mean, like, just forget it for now. But there are other conceptions of virtue, like Hume's, who thinks of virtues as any sort of trait that's useful or agreeable to the self or others. That's how we're thinking of virtues here. Hume's list of virtues, as you can see, is quite long. It's longer than the list of virtues that people usually talk about when they have Aristotelian virtue in mind. And that's how we're thinking about it. I do believe that Aristotelians will be able to find some, Nancy's shaking her head, so never mind. And now I'm going to turn things over to Colin, who's going to talk about how we can be more scientific about virtue.
Is that what she said? I don't think that's what she said. You didn't use actually that much time. So. Oh, good, right. So Valerie and I actually met in the first place because of personal projects. It was Brian Little who developed the personal projects analysis that she was showing you, who knew both of us independently and told us that we should meet each other. And that worked out well, and one of the reasons that it worked out so well is that the approach to thinking about well-being in terms of success in personal projects that Valerie had was very similar to the kind of theoretical approach that I have been taking to try to develop a reasonably comprehensive theory of personality. And so this is a theory that was published this past year. I am going to go over it in at a fairly low level of resolution and focus on some aspects of it that are really important for our project here. But if you're interested in it, it's available online. It's freely available on my website in case you don't have access to that journal. Anyway, so this is cybernetic Big Five theory, and the idea is to try to provide a sort of slightly more formal theoretical psychological grounding for what are the components of people's personalities that we were talking about when we're talking about personal projects and when we're talking about traits, be they virtuous or otherwise. So just to start with a little quick overview of the most basic tenets of this theory. First of all, I categorize all psychological individual differences as either personality traits or characteristic adaptations. And so that means that values have to be one of those things or the other, virtues have to be one of those things or the other. Anything that is a psychological individual differences, I believe, can be categorized as one of those things. And I will certainly define them both as I use them in a minute. Second, traits are culturally universal, which distinguishes them from the characteristic adaptations. And that doesn't mean that all cultures everywhere, say, have the same average level of any given trait. There can certainly be variations. What it means is that it is sensible to describe people in any culture based on anything that we want to call a trait. So for example, I'm sure there were more or less honest cavemen, for example. So we can go anywhere in humanity at any time, and if it's a trait, it should be a meaningful way to describe differences between people, whereas that's not true for characteristic adaptations. And then third, traits reflect stable parameters of evolved cybernetic mechanisms, and I specify this at 3 different levels of the trait hierarchy. And just to say what I mean by that, well, first of all, let me just illustrate what I mean by the trait hierarchy, because I recognize with a mixed audience, I often talk to just personality psychologists, and they all are bored by this stuff because it's so familiar. But in the middle level of this hierarchy here, you can see what is probably familiar even to those of you who are not psychologists, perhaps at this point, the Big Five personality traits. People have been mentioning it a lot over the past couple of days. The Big Five are not conceived to be the only personality traits. What they are sort of major dimensions of covariation among traits. And it turns out they actually have a regular pattern of covariation too, so that there are 2 higher traits even above the Big Five. I'm not going to talk about them today, although I do think they're important. But there are also narrower traits that can be broken out of each of the Big Five. And I've been particularly focused on a level immediately below the Big Five, where each of them has 2 major empirically derived subdimensions. And so just to give you one example, we can break down agreeableness into a dimension that we've called compassion and another that we've called politeness. And these are 2 sort of fundamental, relatively broad still ways to be agreeable. You can be compassionate, which encompasses being empathetic and generous and having a sort of emotional concern for other people. Or you can be polite, which involves suppressing belligerent or exploitative or rude impulses and following social norms to make things run smoothly. And despite the fact that these both covary and can be grouped together within agreeableness, they are meaningfully and usefully distinct. Right? And so that's the important message here, is that at every level of this hierarchy, there is some unique variance to these traits. And we can go down to even finer grained levels called facets, but nobody knows exactly how many facets there should be, so I'm not filling them in here. Just to give one concrete example about how these things matter, we've shown that in terms of people's political attitudes, it's sort of surprised people that there's essentially 0 relationship between political orientation and agreeableness. But it turns out that's because liberals are more compassionate, but conservatives are more polite. So we published a couple of studies showing that, and then it was replicated in a huge sample in New Zealand, so it seems to be pretty robust. All right, so let me just say a little bit more about the Big Five, because I think it's really very important to have an idea about what they are. Because one thing that they are not is a set of scores on a Big Five questionnaire. Right? So that is an attempt to get some kind of a measure of the Big Five dimension, but that is not really what they are. What they are is the major dimensions of covariation among all descriptors of psychological individual differences. So if you take any reasonably large set of descriptions on which people have rated themselves, you will see that they have a factor structure that that closely resembles the big five. Right? So these are the major dimensions that underlie covariation among more specific traits. And this is true not only for normal personality traits, but also for what are considered abnormal personality traits or symptoms or signs of psychopathology. And I think it's really important to mention in this context that this also includes things that we would call virtuous traits. If we throw them into the mix, they are also largely going to be categorizable within this hierarchical taxonomy that is described by the big five. I mean, some of these things, conscientiousness, we would probably already agree is a virtue in most people's minds. So there's no real discrimination here. There's a sense of a continuous variation from the pathological to the virtuous. This is a useful way to kind of organize the major structures within traits. Now, they are heritable, which means that variation in them is correlated with differences with genetic variation, suggesting that there is some reasonably substantial genetic contribution to personality traits. How much there is depends on how you measure it or who you believe. But it is clearly not zero and reasonably substantial, so that's something to think about. Even if, let me just say, even if it were as high as 80% of the variance in personality traits being determined by differences in genetics, that would still leave a lot of room for the environment to influence people's personalities. I feel like there's this kind of paranoid fear that people react against when they see high heritability numbers because they think that means you're taking away the environment's ability to influence people's personalities, but that's simply not the case, as my geneticist friends like to tell me. There's an interesting way in which they've been shown to be genetically universal, which is if you take a set of narrower traits, like say the 30 facet level traits from the NEO, which is a popular measure of the big five, and you look at samples of twins in, I think this was in Japan, in Germany, and in Canada, and you look at the genetic correlations, which you can estimate because you've got twins, so that's a genetically informative sample. You see that structure that comes out, that covariance or factor structure at the genetic level even is the same across various different cultures. So that, I think, feeds into this idea that we can use trait descriptions in any different culture, even if different cultures value different traits differently and have, say, different mean levels of different traits. And they've also been shown to be really important predictors of a lot of things like health and job success and relationship outcomes. So people have been taking them very seriously now for the last, I don't know, let's say 25 or 30 years. But one thing that has been relatively lacking, and of course Will emphasized this for me as well, is that explanatory models. We don't necessarily know where these traits come from, right? So they're I like them because they're this empirical observation. You don't have to have a theory to think that the big five are important because they just appear out of sufficiently large collections of measurements of personality. But once we've got them, surely we want to know where they come from and what actually produces them. And that's really what my interest is. And recently I've been trying to develop a framework based in cybernetics to think about that question of where these traits come from and what are they in a sort of a functional sense psychologically. So cybernetics is the study of goal-directed, self-regulating information processing systems. It was inaugurated by Norbert Wiener in 1948, who wrote a book called Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. And cybernetics really comes out of this realization at the dawn of the computer age, as people were starting to use computers to do really complex things like, let's say, guide missiles or play chess. There was a recognition that the kind of information processing that was necessary for a computer to move toward a goal successfully must have some principles in common with the kind of processes that organisms needed to use to move toward their goals successfully to allow them to survive and reproduce. And so it's an attempt to sort of get at the underlying principles that are common to all goal-directed systems, basically. It was first imported into psychology by Miller, Galanter, and Pribram in 1960 in this book. There's a really nice book in social psychology by Carver and Shire, probably the most extensive application there, called On the Self-Regulation of Behavior. And then I really like Jeffrey Gray's discussion of cybernetics in his last book before he died, but I won't get into that at the moment. let me just give you a brief sense of what are the major components of any cybernetic system, the things that will have to be there if it is a cybernetic system. First, you have to have some representation in the system of a goal or set of goals. And you can think of these as sort of reference values or ranges of values that are somehow instantiated in the system that correspond to a state of the world that the system is going to try to move toward. Right, so you set, just colloquially, of course, you set a goal, then you try to end up in a state of the world where that goal is achieved. In order to do that, you also have to have some kind of representation of the current state because you need to know where you are in relation to your goal. And then that requires some kind of feedback from the environment. You take in information through your senses or sense things about the state of your body. And then once you've got those two representations, a representation of the future and of the desired future and of the present, then there can be some kind of process of comparison that tells you, whether there's a mismatch between where you are and where you want to be. And then there has to be some set of operators, which are behavioral or computational strategies that you can enact that will transform the current state of the world, hopefully, into the desired state of the world. Another useful way to think about the the kind of functions that any cybernetic system has to achieve is through a cyclical schematic. So especially in a system that has multiple goals, like a human being, I mean, think of all the dozens of goals that we juggle and pursue in our lives. Some particular goal has to become active enough to guide action at that particular moment. Then you have to select an action that will hopefully move you toward that goal. You have to attempt to carry it out. This is an interesting stage because you have to be getting this feedback from the environment sufficiently so that you can understand where you are after the action is carried out to tell whether you are nearer to your goal or even have achieved it. And that final process of goal comparison is the thing that does tell you whether you are there or not. Now, if you've arrived at your goal, then great, you're essentially done. You can have some new goal be active. Maybe you can even take a nap, right? It's immediately after lunch. I'm sure some of you are inclined to take a nap right now. And if you have not reached your goal, however, if there's a mismatch in this goal comparison, then you have to cycle back around to the beginning of the cycle, and the same goal will remain active. You'll select a new action, and you'll keep trying to move, right? So it's a bit of a simplification, of course, because most of these processes in a system as complex as a human being are operating in parallel, right? I mean, it's not like you just every once in a while stop and interpret the world around you after you've taken an action. You're doing it constantly, but it's still useful to schematize it this way, in part because there's something of a bottleneck at action, right? It's hard to engage in more than two goal-directed actions at once. And I don't mean like turning your head and reaching your arm, because that's all coordinated toward the same goal. But it's hard to have a conversation with someone and answer an email at the same time. Although in the current age we all try to do it anyway. But we should understand why it's difficult. All right, so that gives us sort of the basic framework for what a cybernetic system is. And now I want to talk about how these individual differences or personality constructs fit into this general kind of a framework. So first of all, what are personality traits? This is the way that I define personality traits in this theory. They're probabilistic descriptions of relatively stable patterns of behavior, motivation, emotion, and cognition in response to classes of stimuli that have been present in human cultures over evolutionary time. So the first part of this turns out to be really easy to explain because Will and Aranda have done all the work for me, right? So I usually use something like this to explain to people what I mean by a probabilistic description of these sort of patterns of states, right? So when we say that somebody has a particular level of extroversion, we don't mean they're talking all the time, although sometimes it may seem like that if you know any severe extroverts. So their behavior fluctuates over time, of course, but the extroverts have a higher average level of talking than the introverts have, and that really corresponds very well, that average, to the measures that we get with the traditional trait measures, where we just have people fill out Likert scales. The things that are, I think, slightly more, unusual to my particular definition is this second half of the definition. So traits are not something that just happen spontaneously without any environmental context. traits are manifested in response to particular classes of stimuli. So if you are an extrovert, you will be much more likely to be engaging in extroverted behavior if there are other people around, or if there are potentially exciting things to do, or if there's something that you might, that might make you laugh. And so people often talk about about traits as being decontextualized, and that's not quite right. It's just that the contexts that are relevant to them are quite broad. So most of these classes of stimuli are present in many, if not most, situations. And they were things like rewards, distractions, uncertainties. These are broad categories of stimuli that we are adapted to in various ways, important ways for survival and pursuit of our goals over evolutionary time, right? And that gets back to this idea that if we're going to call it a trait, it should be something that really applies to all people. In other words, the mechanism is there in everyone. It's something that's evolved to solve some particular problem or deal with some particular class of stimuli. But its parameters may differ from person to person, right? So we all have to be, to some degree, sensitive to reward, or we would not be motivated to do anything. But the degree to which people are sensitive to rewards varies a lot. And this is a slide that I usually spend a lot of time on when I'm talking about this theory, because one of the things that the theory does is that for each of the big five, it basically lays out a theory of what is the underlying function that really unifies the more specific traits that fall within that broad dimension. And this is based on decades worth of behavioral and neurobiological and psychometric research. But I'm not really going to go through all that today because I just don't have time. But the basic idea is that for each one of the big five, we can link it to aspects of cybernetic function. So for example, extroversion seems to be the thing that really reflects differences in people's sensitivity to reward. That's how it plays out in our everyday behaviors, is in terms of, oh, it might be fun to talk to that guy, and that guy, and that guy, right? The one thing that I do want to highlight on this slide is that we've got these first four of the big five here: extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and openness, that pretty clearly end up reflecting functions that are necessary for carrying out this cycle. And there's a really interesting difference when we get to the last one, agreeableness, which is that agreeableness, essentially the mechanisms that underlie it, wouldn't be necessary if we were not a social species. Right? Because they are not necessary just in the abstract for pursuing a goal. What they are necessary for is coordinating the goals of one person with the goals of other people. Right? And this ends up being where a lot of the virtues, and certainly all the interpersonal, or almost all the interpersonal virtues, ends up being categorized in this broad taxonomy of traits. Right? So it's this necessity to have a set of mechanisms that allow us to both detect, understand, and then accommodate the needs and desires of other people as well as our own. And so, which is not to say that there aren't virtues that appear in the other parts of the big five as well. Things like conscientiousness, prudence, caution, courage. All of these things can be slotted in there. And so this is part of why, with Valerie, we've been thinking about this idea, this Humean idea, that the virtues are largely, or sort of at a broad level, either things that help other people to achieve their goals, or things that help, or characteristics that help us to achieve our goals. And then there has to be some kind of balancing act between those, right? If you are exclusively concerned about helping other people pursue their goals to such a degree that you end up screwing up your own life, that might not actually be virtuous. And certainly vice versa. All right, so that's basically my broad account of personality traits, and I think you can see how they fit into the idea that some of these could be more virtuous than others. The other component of personality, from my perspective, is characteristic adaptations. And these are relatively stable goals, interpretations, and strategies that are specified in relation to an individual's particular life circumstances. So these are, as the name suggests, adaptations. They're ways that we adjust to our environments, to our specific circumstances. They're things that we learn and then that persist, right? Because if we're going to call something personality, it has to be persistent. Something that happens once and never happens again is clearly not part of somebody's personality. And yet these are not at the same level of generality or human universality as personality traits. I'll give a couple examples in a minute that will hopefully make this clearer. Another way to think about this is that the characteristic adaptations are the updatable memory contents of the cybernetic system. You encounter various things, you have certain broad tendencies based on your trait parameters, but then you develop ways to interact and to achieve your goals, or even to figure out what your goals are in relation to your specific life circumstances. So anytime you actually have to refer to those circumstances just to define a particular construct that describes individual differences between people, I would describe that as a characteristic adaptation. And this is a way I like to schematize this, partly because the collection of our goals and our interpretations of the world and the strategies that we have for getting from one place to the other essentially form kind of a bounded domain. It's the domain of the known or the familiar. And when we get outside of that, then all kinds of sort of emotional dysregulation typically takes place. One of the things that I was trying to do here was to develop a more systematic account of characteristic adaptations, because I think that they're really important in personality psychology, but they haven't been very clearly sort of organized or theorized. If you look at the main people who have written about them from a theoretical perspective, they don't really give a very clear definition of them. They just provide sort of these laundry lists of things that are supposedly characteristic adaptations. And one of the amazing things is that there's almost no overlap between what McRae and Costa list and what McAdams and Powell's list. Now, I don't think they're wrong. In fact, I think they're largely right. I think all of these things in both of these lists are often characteristic adaptations. The ones that I've got in yellow here, I think, depending on exactly what you're talking about or how you define them, are sometimes traits instead, but that's a different issue. But the reason that I think these are so important for this particular project is that personal projects consist of characteristic adaptations, right? You saw those things that students had written down that Valerie showed you. They mostly read like goals, right? And the way that Brian Little thinks about this is a personal project is a goal plus the various strategies that you have that you're using to pursue it, plus the set of sort of interpretations and evaluations surrounding that you use to interpret the world to allow you to pursue that project. So that really fits nicely into the idea that, you know, you could use one of these as a description of a particular personal project, right? And I think this, for me, this brings a way to kind of formalize what are the components of a personal project. Because rather than having these laundry lists, I've boiled this down to exactly 3 categories. You've got interpretations of what the world is like, which could be both in terms of its meaning or in terms of its facts. You've got various strategies, and you've got various goals. And so one of the things that we're doing in this assessment, this is the final module that Valerie referenced earlier of the personal projects assessment, is that we start with the project that they list, and then we go in both directions. First, we ask them to list what are all the strategies that you're using to pursue this particular project, right? So we get a sense of the means that they're using. And we can do things like qualitative coding for whether these means are virtuous or not, right? We're planning to do some of that. And then we go in the other direction and we ask them, well, are you doing this just because it's an end in itself, or is there some larger reason that you're doing this? And they say, well, here's the reason. And then you say, okay, is that the end, or is there some reason that you're doing that? And we go up until there's something that's like a terminal value. So that is another way to get the kinds of values that people are pursuing and to assess the potentially virtuous qualities of their personal projects. How much time have I got? A couple minutes? All right, let me just give you some examples here, because I think it's nice to sort of see how this distinction between traits and characteristic adaptations plays out. So being argumentative is a trait, right? There were probably more or less argumentative hunter-gatherers, cavemen, people in the Middle Ages, et cetera. It's not going away. But being a lawyer is a characteristic adaptation, right? You know, and I know I said characteristic adaptations are either goals, strategies, or interpretations, but often things that we talk about as characteristic adaptations are collections of those things, right? So you could break down being a lawyer into its constituent goals, its constituent ways of interpreting the world, its constituent strategies. So that's how I think about that. Liking to frolic with friends is a trait. Some people always like it more or less than others anywhere. But belonging to a fraternity is a characteristic adaptation. Being prevention-focused is a trait, but checking the stove every time you leave the house is a characteristic adaptation. Right? These things so they're related to each other, but one is defined in terms of your specific adaptation to your life circumstances. Having an insecure attachment style in general is a trait, but being insecurely attached to your current partner is a characteristic adaptation. And then I thought I'd come up with one that was really on the virtue theme. Being helpful is a trait, but always accepting all review requests is a characteristic adaptation. Yeah, maladaptations. Yes, they can certainly be maladaptations. And when I apply this idea to psychopathology, we go there. And so I'm going to end, and then I guess we'll just skim very briefly over our sort of progress, because there's not much to say because we're still collecting data. But this is sort of the idea of what we're interested in assessing here, is the way that personality change happens and how people become more or less virtuous over time, and how that impacts their well-being through this lens of their personal projects. So basically, the idea here is that you can see that these underlying parameters of these mechanisms are what produce these patterns of behavior and emotion and motivation and cognition that we describe as traits. And then those traits can also drive particular different characteristic adaptations. Like if I'm extremely extroverted, I'm going to have a different set of ways that I've adapted to going to conferences than somebody who's extremely introverted, for example. And those will be various habits or strategies that I use. But then those things can sometimes feed back and actually, over time, potentially influence these basic mechanisms that might end up changing my traits. So if you adopt a set of projects that really entail some particular virtue, for example, we think that that might, over time, feed back to actually encourage you to have that more general disposition toward that virtue. So the way that we're going about thinking about these ideas empirically is that we are doing a longitudinal study of undergraduates. And in this case, I think undergraduates are not just a convenience sample, because this is a time in life when people are very much concerned with the development of their personalities and their identities, and who they are and what they should be doing and what kind of a person they should be. So we think it's actually quite useful in that regard. We're doing 4 waves, so once every semester. We've got the first wave going on now. They're going to come in and tell us about their personal projects and fill out descriptions of their personalities and virtues, et cetera. And we're going to do that 4 times. And this is sort of an idea of some of the major things. There's some other stuff that we're assessing too, but these are the major things. One thing I'd like to note is that we're not only having them rate their own personality and their own virtues using the VIA, we're also having each one of them nominate, I think, three people who know them very well to also fill out these questionnaires. So this is one way we're trying to get around some of these issues with self-report, is to triangulate by having peer ratings. And there's a lot of research in personality and industrial psychology showing that you do get incremental validity from getting other people's ratings of their personalities as well as their self-ratings. And the hypotheses that we're testing, well, we're sort of still working out some of the more detailed ones, but in general, this hypothesis is that virtue involving personal projects are going to lead to increases in virtuous traits. And we're also considering the converse as well, that somebody who seems to be particularly high in a particular virtue in this general way, dispositionally, may, over the course of their college career, come to have more and more virtuous projects as well. So do you want to come up here and help out with this part? Or are you just happy sitting down?
I think we should skip to the...
Okay.
Yeah,
well, so this is just, the basic idea is, for example, if you have projects that are largely about relationships, we may see greater improvements in traits relating to agreeableness, fairness, gratitude, kindness, forgiveness. This is sort of the idea. And then in relation to what I was saying about also eliciting the strategies that people are using to pursue particular projects, we're interested in this idea that, the idea of virtuous means, that if people select more versus less virtuous strategies for any particular project or type of project, that may lead to increases in virtue and well-being potentially as well. Deep integration.
Right. So at this stage, I think it's been more of a learning experience for me because we haven't started writing yet. Yeah. And because we're at the data accumulation stage. And I guess one thing that I've found, I really appreciated what Gus said about this. I had a lot of the same experience of, where is Gus? I don't know. There he is. That just the kind of fun of it, and the doing something different that's different from sitting in front of your laptop and writing. But at the same time, it really gave me a sense of how hard it is. And in particular, to me, one of the main challenges has been to figure out how to measure things that are not only of interest to everybody, but things for which there's a scale developed that Colin and Moyne both think is a decent scale. So that's been challenging. Like, I'll find a scale and I'll say, this looks good, and they're like, no, we're not doing it. So there's been that kind of challenge has been interesting.
Oh yeah, I guess if we're going to talk about obstacles, so our original plan, we had an intervention involved, but there was a really thorough and we found compelling critique from one of our reviewers here, presumably in this room, about the fact that our intervention was too much like our assessment paradigm, and that was likely to lead to trouble. And we said, you know what, yeah, you're right. We think this kind of intervention is essentially a goal setting or future authoring intervention. We think it's incredibly promising. There's really an interesting field of research opening up around this, but this was probably not the context to pursue it in. So maybe in a later study, I mean, progress, you know, we're collecting data, that's good.
Yeah, we did. I mean, that was interesting too, that, like, you know, I figured there's this thing, personal projects analysis, it's a tool, good, let's just give it to people. Yeah. But no, it turns out you have to have it in a format that allows students to do it on a computer, and the same with the VIA.
Brian had an elaborate Excel sheet that was
didn't work. So yeah, so we've done a lot of changing the technology to make it work.
Pragmatics.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Fantastic, of course. Very interesting, both of you. I can try to figure out what the combination was that I like so much, but I think clear, provocative, and logically tight, I think, is sort of the perfect combination.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna save my questions for Colin for dinner. Instead, ask Valerie a question, or both of you, really. But the part you were talking about, which I think I might have asked you this in another conference, but I still can't understand the trouble with life satisfaction. I think it's been, you know, confusedly lumped together with positive affect and negative affect, which makes people think it's a hedonistic term, but it's not, right? It's the degree to which you've accomplished the values you have. So I'm not sure why it doesn't fall into the first theory, and then I'm not sure why philosophers are uncomfortable with it.
It's the degree to which you feel like you've accomplished the values you have.
Right. What if you are wrong?
That's different. So this is why I think there aren't any preference satisfaction psychologists, because preference satisfactionists in philosophy think what you succeed in, what's good for you is actually getting what you want. It's not the satisfaction that you get from getting what you want. It's not feeling fulfilled. It's not having a sense that your life is going well. It is the obtaining of the object of your desire.
You'd probably get more sympathy from clinical psychologists.
So are you focusing on the satisfaction part of that phrase, life satisfaction? Is that because I don't think of satisfaction as being, you know, a feeling, right? And I don't think it's defined as a feeling. It's defined, you know,
right.
For most psychologists, it's defined as a cognitive evaluation of whether you've actually met.
It's a subjective response to the world.
Right, and so
whether it's cognitive or affective is not relevant. I mean, like if my desire is to be a marathon runner, here's the thing that divides the two views. Okay. The experience machine. So if I desire to be a marathon runner, and I do some kind of virtual reality thingy-majig where I feel like I'm running, but I'm actually lying there in a vat. According to the preference satisfaction theory, that is not good for me. Whereas according to the life satisfaction theorist, if I'm, you know, here's where these crazy philosophical thought experiments can be frustrating, but if we really imagine that I am completely convinced that I'm doing this, and you ask me how my life is going, and I go, I'm doing the stuff I want to do. My life is awesome. Those two views will have different verdicts about whether you've achieved welfare.
Okay, so I have a response to that, but I don't know if. We should go on. Yeah, exactly. But thank you. So that really helped clarify.
Now we both have to sit with you at dinner.
And the reason that I said the clinical psychologist is that I think you can imagine, like, you're a clinical psychologist and your client comes and says, "My life is so good right now. I've gotten into this great relationship." And then you're like, "Oh, what's that like?" And then they describe it, and you're like, "Oh no, this is not good." Right? Yeah, later.
Yes, I really enjoyed your talk. And I have a few questions, but I'll ask one question to Colin about your slide on characteristic adaptations.
Yeah.
So there's a diagram where you sort of describe characteristic adaptations enabling you to get from your current state to a desired state, right? And looking at that diagram, it made me think that your description of characteristic adaptations seem very broad with regard to goals, right? So the goals are stable, but it could be a broad goal or a very minute goal, right? So I could have the goal of...
There is a restriction, though, right? So this is one thing that I think confuses people a lot about understanding traits, is that traits have goals associated with them, right? So if you're an extrovert, you like certain types of rewards, like social affiliation, social status, and those can be conceived as goals, right? You have more of a motivation or goal towards social status. But notice that this is specified in relation to an individual's particular life circumstances. Just having a goal for status is not enough to make it a characteristic adaptation. It has to be like, my goal is to be an esteemed professor, for example. And then that is a characteristic adaptation because it's located in context.
Right, but it seems that, so would you say a characteristic adaptation of being a lawyer and a characteristic adaptation of, schmoozing at dinner tonight, right?
Yeah.
Those are equivalent examples of characteristic adaptations.
Those are both, I would say those are both characteristic adaptations. They are also manifestations of traits, right? This is the thing, characteristic adaptations can represent ways in which traits get manifested. In fact, almost everything we do is a manifestation of both traits and our particular characteristic adaptations. Right. Only if we get into some particularly novel situation where we haven't really worked out some habitual pattern will we get something that's really more of a pure expression of traits. Usually it's going to be overlaid with the various habits and strategies that we've learned and acquired in relation to particular life circumstances.
Again, a wonderfully provocative presentation. Thinking as a developmentalist, I wanted to have you explain to me undergraduate students as a sample for testing this.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that undergraduates, a lot of their personal projects are immediate and time-driven, but a lot of them are, aspirational.
Yeah.
As novice adults, they're just beginning to think about, I want to be a MacArthur fellow.
Career, yeah, all these things.
And that kind of led me in the direction of also asking, are all personal projects comparably generative of virtue? And will that be able to be something you'll be able to see over the time period? So I realize that's 2 or 3 questions, but they're all linked to sort of thinking about this as a developmental stage.
I mean,
one thing we should say is that Moin Syed is a developmentalist who specializes in the college population. I don't know if we said that. I mean,
we
so
didn't, but we should
do.
have.
Yeah, we do have someone who's an expert
Yeah.
on the team, which is nice.
Yeah. But I think both of us would say no. It's not. We don't think that all personal projects are equally likely to foster virtue.
No, I wasn't sure if you meant all in general, or if you meant at different periods of life, at different life stages.
Well, the latter actually led to the former, but from what I can tell, you've got a taxonomy of personal projects. But I didn't see that there was any filtering through them in relation to the change in traits that you were expecting to see in the college.
Well, so that was first of all just a sort of preliminary offhand taxonomy that Valerie created. I mean, one thing is that Brian has been working with this methodology for decades now, and he's actually worked out sort of a taxonomy of the major categories. And we actually have people select on their own which of several major categories or other these things fit into. So we've got individuals categorization. We can then go back and do that, figure out a coding scheme ourselves. But we did have certain hypotheses about this. For example, that academic projects might be the ones where you would be more likely to see facilitation of certain kinds of virtues related to conscientiousness, for example, and relationship projects.
I mean, I chose those categories essentially to create a link to the objective list theories of welfare. So I was sort of looking through there thinking, what would these various theorists of well-being and philosophy care about here? So the projects might, in the end, they'll probably get coded in multiple ways, but that's why I did that for these purposes.
So that was really interesting. Colin, I'm wondering, so the hypotheses that you formulate seem plausible, but it wasn't clear to me that they are distinctively motivated by your theory of traits and characteristics adaptations. I mean, presumably everyone who thinks about cognitive architecture thinks you have interpretation strategies and goals.
Yeah.
So is there something distinctive that you would predict?
Yeah, well, so I would say partly I'm just using my theory as a sort of an organizing lens to help think about what are the important pieces of personal projects. But in terms of the specific hypotheses, the most specific sets of hypotheses in my theory come at the trait level, with assigning particular psychological functions to different traits. And so here I sort of list the ideas about the big five, but I've also broken it down with specific ideas about each of the 10 more specific traits underneath. And so the instrument that we're using to assess the big five here breaks each one down into the 2 dimensions that I showed early on in my talk. So I think hopefully where the more substantial rather than formal portion of my theory will be useful is in figuring out so we're going to be able to empirically, based on our own data and based on other people's data, start mapping some of these virtuous traits onto this kind of standard Big Five taxonomy, and then think about what the implications are for the kind of psychological functions that would need to develop to support different traits and therefore different virtues.
I had two comments. First, thank you very much. It was wonderful. One was just help with preference. I mean, it's sort of like, look, the preference people I know are either Bayesians or very serious rational choice theorists or game theorists. Those aren't understood. They're entirely agnostic about whether you can treat these as psychological states or not. They're patterns in choices among lottery tickets. That's what a preference is. I mean, strictly. They're not in the head by most ways of thinking about it. They're just in the model, and they're beautiful. But and then, I mean, on goals, I had some question about whether all of your projects are going to lend themselves to this particular way of thinking about goals, because this particular way of thinking about goals, which I love and have studied a lot, is based on thinking about a goal as a stopping place for something, an endpoint, like you get it or you don't get it, or you get partway there, or you have to choose alternate means or something. A lot of the kinds of things that are traditionally associated with virtue don't have that shape. It's not like justice, been there, done that. Or health, been there, done that, next, right? And so it seemed to me that you could do it by just supposing a whole series of goals where the relations among them were part of what was showing the thing that you wanted to show if you were interested in a virtue or health or something like that, that were non-accidentally linked by some other kind of pattern. But just the basic model doesn't look to me to work as well for virtue things as for some other kinds of goals, like crossing the street.
I have a couple of thoughts about that.
I mean, well, my immediate thought is I didn't think of the goals as stopping points, and I guess I thought because the way Colin sees these things, there are these cycles of, reevaluating or re-upping your commitment to the goal after you get some experience. I wasn't thinking of it that way.
And I think
But feedback mechanisms are much, I mean, for that you need these long enduring things where you don't achieve them.
Yeah. From a sort of early cybernetic perspective, these goals were usually modeled as single reference values, right? Where you're just aiming to get the system to that value. But as control theories have gotten more and more complex, I just casually call it all cybernetics, right? Some people would say, oh, cybernetics is only that first sort of original formulation, and now we've got other types of control theories. I don't really care what you call it. I'm calling it all cybernetics. And so you can develop goals that are essentially represented by a whole ranges of values. You can even have a system in which more is always better on some dimension, right? Like where you are in such a state where anytime you had a chance to be more just, for example, the system would move toward that, right? So it's not a closed particular value or even a closed range necessarily. So I think there are control architectures that can allow for the kind of process that you're describing. But I think that's a really good point, and we should be thinking about that.
Last question. So I'm curious about whether or not you think there are specific virtues that might be more relevant for a college-age population in terms of both the kind
Temperance.
of developmental tasks that are set up for college, but also in terms of what social support is available. So if you've got people and you're doing your study with undergraduates at Minnesota, then there's going to be enormous pressure for them to adopt extroverted goals and goals related to agreeableness, but probably actually, my experience of being at a Big Ten campus was that openness and intellect weren't actually very important among my peer group, at least. And neither is conscientiousness necessarily. In fact, being fashionably late is really important to accomplishing extroverted goals well, and so forth. And so, to what extent do you think that?
We think that matrix that's assessing conflict between different projects is going to be really important for things like that.
But it's also true that so many of them mention stop procrastinating as a goal or a personal project, and that makes you think conscientiousness actually might be particularly important for undergraduate students. And a lot of them, keeping in touch with family, calling home, calling my mom, that's some kind of time management skill that could be associated with a virtue like I don't know, conscientiousness or patience,
Responsibility,
or, something like that.
Slightly social, like the social side of conscientiousness.
Yeah.
basically,
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.